Good morning. This is going to be part 4 of my series on scientific evidence that supports astrology. And today I want to look at mundane astrology. That is the astrology that looks at the fate of the nations. And as such, it's a little bit removed from the subjectivity or bias that may enter when you just look at charts of people and talk to people. And most of what I have today is going to be case studies. I've added a lot more material beyond what I have in just my original slideshow, which is available in a PDF format. And we'll look, as I said, mostly at case studies, but then I have a very interesting scientific study at the end of this. This one's a little bit longer, so let's get started. I'll share my screen. And I've got to get rid of a few panels here so that I can see what I'm doing. And I think we're ready to start. So, evidence from mundane astrology. Mundane astrology studies world events and the fate of the nations. And as a subject of scientific inquiry, it avoids the subjectivity that is often associated with studying the astrological charts of individuals. But in studying world events, it should be noted that most days are pretty much the same, both astrologically and in terms of daily news. However, when astrological conditions are extreme, we often see similarly extreme events in the news, and the results are compelling. In this presentation, we'll look at an event that ushered in many of the world's major religions and philosophies, the American War and how history is repeating itself, the 60s, September 11th, 2001, the 2020 pandemic, January 6th, 2021, the war in Ukraine, past and recent influences of Chiron on America, the road ahead, and a statistical study on mundane astrology. So we'll start with this event that ushered in many of the world's major religions and philosophies. And this was between the years 577 and 574 BCE, when there were a series of conjunctions. There were 7 exact conjunctions here and 1 near conjunction, right here in the dash circle, between the outer planets Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And the expectation is that this would release an influence that would lead humanity to transcendent heights. What was observed during this period were the beginnings and developments of several major religions and philosophies to an extent that has never been seen since. This period of time coincides generally with the birth of Taoism, Confucianism, Buddhism, the Golden Age of Greek philosophy, the writing of the Torah during the Babylonian exile, and the composition of parts of the Upanishads. Okay, next, the American Civil War and how history is repeating itself. Okay, since the 1990s, America has become increasingly polarized as a political center has shrunk more and more over the years. And that's what these graphs up here show. That political center is getting smaller and smaller. And today, many historians and pundits are repeatedly saying that current conditions are as they were right before the American Civil War in the 1860s. However, before these people were talking about the Civil War, the very first person I heard raise this possibility was an astrologer. And so let's look at the astrological indications that we are headed towards some sort of conflict. First, though, one good question to ask is which chart to use for America, because there are actually several, and sometimes the birth of a country is a process rather than a specific moment in time. So I generally use a July 2nd, 1776 chart for when the Revolution for Independence was unanimously passed, as well as the July 4th, 1776 Sibley chart for when the text of the resolution was ratified. I call these respectively the Resolution for Independence and the Declaration for Independence charts. And also because birth times are often uncertain in these situations, I frequently will use a 0 degrees Aries rising chart. And that's what I say here. The main differences between these two charts are that the moons are in different signs and Mars and Venus have moved a few degrees. Also, one has Libra rising, this one, while the other, July 4th, has Sagittarius rising. But despite that, as I just said, I often use 0 degrees rising charts with mundane events when I'm uncertain about the time. Thus, using the natural association of Aries with the first house, Taurus with the second, and so on. Okay, now in both of these charts, for America, the planet Neptune is in Virgo, squaring Mars and Gemini, which you have right here. And Neptune in Virgo gives our country an unfortunate capacity to convince itself that delusional thinking is logical, and we have seen this happen repeatedly all the way from slavery and the mistreatment of Native Americans to the current interpretation by some that white nationalism is moral and just. And then the square by Mars and Gemini inflames the passions surrounding such thinking in ways that lead to violent rhetoric, if not violent action. Now, when Neptune and Mars are stimulated in these charts, trouble can follow. Okay, looking to the past, in March of 1855, prior to this war, the planet Uranus was in Taurus, conjunct the true north node of the moon. And 2 weeks later, the territory of Kansas held its first election. This was an election that put Kansas at the epicenter of the slavery issue, as many people from Missouri crossed the border to vote illegally in that election in order to elect a pro-slavery legislature. Those people who did that are now referred to in history as the border ruffians. Fortunately, 6 years later, Kansas entered the Union as a free state. Okay, now with Uranus and Taurus conjunct the North Node, well, Uranus and Taurus, this could be individual values that cause people to revolt, protest, and conjunct the North Node, that just intensifies everything. All right, the next occurrence of Uranus conjunct the North Node in Taurus happened on July 31st, 2002. And it was joined by transiting Mars. Also, Kansas was once again at the political epicenter, since on August 2nd, there was a vote on whether to remove protections for a woman's right to choose an abortion from the state constitution. Once again, there were efforts to suppress the votes of political progressives, but fortunately, the voters were overwhelmingly pro-choice. Still, this election has been a preview of an issue that will dangerously divide America again, resulting in great conflict. So you can see here that history is repeating itself, and I could enlarge the symbol to include Mars. It's at 17 plus degrees Taurus. The node and Uranus are at 18 plus degrees Taurus. So we've repeated basically the same configuration we saw in 1855. And it's interesting that, again, Kansas was at the center of everything. And there was an issue that Americans are deeply divided on. Okay, a year after Kansas became a territory in March 1856, Jupiter and Neptune were conjunct in Pisces and opposition to natal Neptune and square natal Mars in both of the charts that I use for America. Additionally, transiting Saturn, frustration and restriction, was conjunct natal Mars, aggression. In America, this was a time with violent clashes between pro and anti-slavery forces that went down in history with the name Bloody Kansas. And the next time Jupiter and Neptune were conjunct in Pisces was in April of 2022. Once again, the conjunction was in opposition to natal Neptune and square natal Mars. Jupiter and Neptune in Pisces represent a more progressive philosophy that clashes with Neptune and Virgo. It stirred up the aggressive rhetoric of Mars and Gemini. Also, while things have yet to become as violent as they did in 1856, we're still a very divided nation and passions are becoming hot. Okay, anytime you have a slow-moving planet moving through Pisces, it's going to trigger the square between natal Neptune and Mars and all of those July 1776 charts. Again, we're seeing history repeat itself. Now, the resolution for independence chart works well to explain the outbreak of the Civil War. Transiting Neptune in Aries, militaristic fanaticism, was exactly square to the degree natal Venus, representing core values. And that Venus is also the ruler of the first house in this Libra rising chart. And transiting Uranus and Mars, representing revolution, right up here, they were conjunct natal Uranus. Notice also the transiting Saturn-Chiron opposition right here that mirrors the natal Saturn-Chiron opposition in this July 2nd, 1776 chart, and also the July 4th, 1776 chart. Okay, so this tells you what the astrological weather was like at the outbreak pretty much of the Civil War. Okay, I've got April 12th here, I've got April 13th here. Actually, the Civil War broke out on April 12th officially with shots fired on Fort Sumter. And then on April 13th, Neptune moved into Aries. So close enough for government work. Particular date I'm keeping my eye on, though, is February 19th, 2026. On that date, transiting Saturn, Moon, and Neptune will all be conjunct at 0 degrees Aries and squaring natal Venus at 0 degrees Cancer in the resolution for independence chart. The late great mundane astrologer Andre Barbeau has written that Saturn-Neptune conjunctions are often about popular insurrections that are usually fired up by ideological beliefs. So this could be a very dangerous time for America. So we have some interesting times ahead. It may culminate around this date in 2026. So will there be another civil war? That is very difficult to say. There's certainly adverse conditions ahead, but it's we who collectively decide how to respond to them. The more mature and spiritually awakened we are, the less difficulty there will be. Plus, it's hard to imagine a war between the blue and the gray such occurred in the 1860s. Today, the divide is between the blue and the red, but even without deadly battles between armies, there are certain conflicts that are either happening now or could easily happen in the future. And here are some of the things that could be. We see the country is already badly divided between blue and red. Abortion rather than slavery may be the issue that divides us the most. LGBTQ rights is another issue that political parties are divided on. There's also division related to marijuana, immigration, white nationalism, and Donald Trump. California has already blocked official state travel to states that don't support LGBTQ rights. And we're at the start of the division into states that allow abortion and those that don't. If more states begin restricting official travel to other states or curtail the economic flow, then we may indeed drift apart into two separate countries. Throughout all of this, the severity of climate change is a wild card, since that may invoke certain responses from us, whether we like them or not. And as tensions grow, we will likely see more domestic terrorism, first from lone wolves, and maybe later from more organized militia groups. And lastly, Ron DeSantis in Florida has announced his intention to create a civilian military force called the State Guard. So there are a lot of ways in which conflict can occur and the Union weaken without an all-out military conflict between the states. However, the choice is ultimately ours. We can choose to build rather than destroy. We can choose revolutionary inventions instead of revolutionary war. And we can choose positive transformation over death. It's all up to us. Thus, I don't really know if there will be a civil war or not. It all depends on the choices that we make. All I know is that what is what the weather ahead will look like, astrologically, that is, and some of the choices that will be given to us. Hence, may we all choose wisely. Okay, the next section we'll look at is the 60s, and this is very interesting. A lot of the social upheaval and revolution in the 60s was due to this rare conjunction of Uranus and Pluto. So on October 9th, 1965, Uranus revolution and Pluto rebellion made the first of three conjunctions that would take place in Virgo over the next couple of years. This is the conjunction that ushered in all the great social changes that we associate with the 60s. And on April 12th, 1966, there was a conjunction of Saturn and Neptune in Pisces. This coincided with the rise of interest in Eastern spirituality and meditative disciplines. Pisces represented that non-physical, meditative spirituality. Saturn represented the discipline, Chiron, the transcendence. Also, the year 1967 was known for the Summer of Love, and it was initiated earlier in that year by a grand trine involving Jupiter, Neptune, Saturn, and Chiron, all in water signs here. Okay? So we had a grand trine in water signs involving Neptune, Jupiter, Saturn, and Chiron. We saw flower children, meditation, marijuana, psychedelics. That's the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, Hare Krishnas, and environmentalism. And some of the themes and sayings of that period were, if it feels good, do it. That was an expression of Neptune in Scorpio. And we also saw communes and new families being formed. That relates to Jupiter in Cancer. We saw deep spirituality relating to Chiron and Pisces, and also a weakening of restrictions. That was represented by Saturn in Pisces. Well, once again, history repeats itself. In 2013, we had what I call the summer of non-binary love and cannabis. And we had a very similar astrological configuration to what we had in the 60s, a grand trine involving Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, and Chiron, with a couple of differences. Some of the events that happened that year were SCOTUS ruled Defense of Marriage Act unconstitutional. That opened the way for same-sex marriages. And then Pew polls showed majority support for the first time for both same-sex marriage and cannabis legalization. So, astrologically, it was high times represented by Neptune and Pisces, expanded definition of families again, Jupiter and Cancer, including non-binary families, and what I call spiritual, not religious, represented by the Chiron and Pisces. But this is the big difference. Back in the 60s, we had Neptune in Scorpio, and so motto was, if it feels good, do it. This time we have Saturn in Scorpio. Saturn is regulation, discipline. So our motto was legalization of cannabis with appropriate regulation. Now let's look at 9/11, September 11th, 2001. Most research into mundane astrology involves case studies, and the events of 9/11, 2001 are a good one. Important aspect on this day was Pluto destruction opposite Saturn infrastructure. We had Pluto in Sagittarius, Saturn in Gemini. But why America? Why did this aspect come down so hard on America? Well, here is one reason. The Pluto-Saturn opposition on 9/11 had a special resonance for America since it was strongly conjunct the ascendant-descendant axis in the Sibley chart for America, which is just one of several relevant USA charts. Okay, so let's see, we had 12 degrees Sagittarius rising and Pluto at 12 degrees Sagittarius, Saturn on the descendant at 14 degrees Gemini on September 11th, 2001. But we can go even further this. Why was it New York City that was attacked? And this is very interesting. The association with New York City becomes clear when we look at the chart for its incorporation with all boroughs in 1898. Both this chart and the 9/11 chart have a Pluto-Saturn opposition in the signs Gemini and Sagittarius. The only difference is that instead of Pluto being in Sagittarius, it's now in Gemini. Instead of Saturn being in Gemini, it's now in Sagittarius. But look how close Saturn on 9/11 was to Pluto on January 1st, 1898. Okay, less than a degree apart from one another. This, astrologically, it made conditions just right for a catastrophic attack on New York City. Okay, let's move on to the 2020 pandemic. On January 12th, 2020, Pluto, representing death, was conjunct Saturn, destruction, in Capricorn right here. And that began a cycle of transformation of structures that will last until 2053. This was essentially the start of the pandemic and other major changes, and is also the date on which I got COVID for the first time. Lucky me. Furthermore, since this conjunction occurred in the 22nd degree of Capricorn, this may add extra tension to the situation, and this is because 22.5 degrees is 3/4 of the way through a 30-degree cycle, just as 270 degrees is 3/4 of the way through a 360-degree cycle. Hence, this degree position in any sign may be like a waning square. Also, the late great mundane astrologer Andre Barbeau observed that pandemics and conflicts are often triggered by hard aspects between Saturn and Pluto, particularly when they are magnified either by Jupiter, an eclipse, or other adverse conditions. And that's exactly what happened 2 days before the exact conjunction. On January 10th, 2020, we had a lunar eclipse. Pluto and Saturn just about 10 months of arc of separation from one another. Mercury and Sun, both at 20 plus degrees Capricorn. Jupiter and the south lunar node, both at 8 plus degrees Capricorn. All of this, of course, in opposition to the moon at this north lunar node. And the planet Chiron was making a somewhat wide square to both poles here. So it was, again, an extreme day astrologically. And as a consequence, there were extreme results. This triggered that pandemic, at least from an astrological perspective. Furthermore, the Saturn-Pluto conjunction on January 12th, 2020, was conjunct China's natal Jupiter at 22 plus degrees Capricorn, and Jupiter is also the ruler of China's rising sign. Hence, astrologically speaking, it's no wonder that the pandemic began in China. Here you see the Saturn-Pluto conjunction very tightly conjunct this Jupiter, which rules China's rising sign. Okay, on March 20th, 2020, Jupiter and Mars were conjunct in Capricorn at the same degree as the recent Pluto-Saturn conjunction. This energized and expanded the original Pluto-Saturn impulse, and the COVID pandemic grew. It was in this month that it really began to grow exponentially in a very noticeable way. On November 12th, 2020, Jupiter and Pluto were conjunct at 22 degrees Capricorn. That same position that we had for the Pluto-Saturn conjunction. And this brought the pandemic back to the forefront. However, while Saturn contracts, Jupiter expands, and we saw not only a surge in COVID cases during this month, but also the development of effective vaccines. This was the month where we got back the results that vaccines are safe and highly effective. Additionally, the Barbo Planetary Cycle Index was at its low for the century from the beginning of 2020 until late March 2022. And this index is a cumulative sum of the distances from the outer planets, from Jupiter through Pluto. And when the index is low, that means that the outer planets are bunched close together, resulting in an imbalance. Also, from January through April of 2022, the non-lunar planets were hemmed in on one side by the lunar nodes, a condition known as Kalasarpa yoga that inhibits the flow of energy. Furthermore, the index hit its absolute low in late March 2022, and Chiron was squaring natal sun in July 1776 charts for America. And by the way, Pluto was also still very close to conjunction with natal Pluto in those July 1776 charts. So if last March felt really bad to you, March 2022, now you know why. Now let's take a quick look at what was going on January 6th of 2021. There were several transits creating tension in the July 2nd, 1776 chart. On January 6, 2021, we had transiting Pluto. Destruction was closely conjunct the moon, which represents the people, and opposite Mercury, the people's voice. Transiting Uranus, revolution, was square the natal lunar nodes right here, and here. Transiting Neptune was opposite natal Neptune. That causes delusion. And also, it triggers, this makes the square with the natal Mars. Oops, let me go back one. And the transiting north node intensity was conjunct that natal Mars. That creates additional aggression. So all of this was coming into play, creating a perfect storm for the insurrection that occurred on January 6, 2021. Now, as for the war in Ukraine, again, recall that the Barbo Planetary Cycle Index was at its low for the century from the beginning of 2020 until late March 2022. All of the outer planets were closely bunched together. And we had that condition I just mentioned, known as Kalasarpa yoga, where all the non-lunar planets are hemmed in on one side of the lunar nodes, inhibiting the flow of energy. And as I said in just a few slides previously, this index hit its absolute low in late March 2022, and Chiron was squaring natal sun in the July 1776 charts. And also, transiting Pluto was still closely conjunct natal Pluto in those charts. So, what began in 2020, it found its greatest intensification in some respects in March 2022. Also, if we look at Putin's chart, I should mention there is some dispute over Putin's birthday, birth time, birthplace. But this is the chart most astrologers used for October 7th, 1952. It's been confirmed by Putin's webmaster, and I've been using it for a few years. It seems to be very reliable. So on January 12th, 2020, that Saturn-Pluto conjunction made a strong quinquenance to Putin's natal Pluto at 22 plus degrees Leo, which is also conjunct his lunar nodal axis, the south node. And this conjunction also squared his 12th house Mercury-Neptune conjunction. So going all the way back to January 12th, 2020, this conjunction of Saturn and Pluto likely fueled Putin's desire to possess Ukraine, to expand the homeland. Notice that north node, opposite Pluto and south node here, it's conjunct the cusp of his 4th house representing home, in this case, the homeland for Russia. So this likely fueled his desire to possess Ukraine. Also, on February 24th, 2022, that is when Russia invaded Ukraine. Both Mars and Jupiter were at this very important degree again, 22 plus degrees Capricorn. So while the pandemic was being brought under control, the impact on Putin of the 2020 Saturn-Pluto conjunction was just beginning to unleash its most destructive power. Also on February 24th, 2020, Saturn was making a strong square to Pluto right here in Ukraine's chart. This created a resonance with the 2020 Saturn-Pluto conjunction. Additionally, Chiron was square natal Uranus very strongly. Chiron at 10 plus degrees Aries, square Uranus at 10 plus degrees Capricorn, and the lunar nodes were squaring natal Mercury, Venus, and Jupiter. Again, very, very strong. So a lot of tension in Ukraine's chart on that day. Now, let's take a quick look at some past and recent influences of Chiron on America. Chiron resides between Saturn and Uranus, and it's like a bridge between what can be seen and what can't be seen. Bridge between the personal and the transpersonal. Chiron always urges us to transcend ourselves, but in so doing, it often has to crack that hard shell that Saturn has created. And so the impact of Chiron is frequently wounding, followed by healing, followed by transcendence. Well, Chiron, it actually was recently in opposition to Saturn. The July 1776 charts on March 17th. Thus, there may be some wounding or addressing of past actions at this point. And recently, we've seen Donald Trump in the news, and he's dividing America again. And we've seen indications that there may be a ruling soon on whether women will still have access to the abortion pill nationwide. Well, the same opposition, by the way, that occurred in September 2022 and was immediately followed by Hurricane Ian, which did a lot of wounding to Florida. And we also had this opposition occurring in May 2022. It was immediately preceded by the shootings, mass shooting at the Top supermarket in Buffalo, New York, and about a week later by the horrific school shooting in Uvalde, Texas. Okay. In May 2022, had Mars conjunct Neptune at that time. Now we have Mars square Neptune at this time. I've put a dash circle around natal Chiron here because with transing Chiron at 14 plus degrees Aries, it's eventually going to come into conjunction with natal Chiron at 20 plus degrees Aries. So as Chiron goes from this exact opposition to this exact conjunction, there may be some continued wounding going on. That has to be followed by healing and transcendence. But this is not the first time we've gone through something like this. So here's another instance of history repeating itself. From 1972 to 75, Transing Chiron made a series of oppositions to natal Saturn, a series of conjunctions to natal Chiron in the July 1776 charts for America. And these aspects, as I keep saying, can trigger either healing, wounding healing, or transcendence. And the major story during this period was Watergate scandal. That was the major wounding that America received. And the Senate Select Committee to investigate the scandal. The Watergate Committee at that time, that was one of Congress's finest moments. So this represented the transcendent aspect of Chiron. But also during this period in 1973, that's when Roe v. Wade made it legal for women to choose an abortion if they wanted to. Well, we're experiencing something very similar to what we saw in the 70s over the years, 22 to 2025, with a very near miss of Chiron, conjunct natal Chiron, lasting from June through September of this year, 2023, in the July 1776 charts for America. And so far during this period, we've seen the January 6th committee, again, Congress having one of its finer moments, rising to the occasion, transcending their personal and petty concerns. And we've been very wounded still, wounded from the January 6th, 2021 insurrection, and have ongoing investigation and indictments related to that. But also during this period, Roe v. Wade was back in the news. 2022, the Supreme Court overturned its 1973 decision. And that is also, I think, a great wound for many Americans. Okay, let's take a quick look at the road ahead. We've seen a lot of instances where there were extreme astrological conditions, and that corresponded to extreme events that occurred. So this mundane astrology stuff seems to work, and here's what I think might happen in the near future and over the next 3 years. So first, on March 23rd, 2023, just a few days after I'm making this video, finally we have the long-awaited entry of Pluto in Aquarius. And this is going to initiate a 21-year period in which we will likely see many new inventions in technology and a transfer of power from individuals to the masses. Also, some of the technologies that already appear to be on the horizon are clean nuclear fusion that can provide unlimited power, quantum computing, virtual reality, artificial intelligence. Additionally, education has seen an increased use of Zoom technology and online chat rooms for collaborative learning. All these Zoom meetings, that fits in with the new technologies that coincide with Pluto traveling through Aquarius. And these online chat rooms for collaborative learning, that coincides with the tendency for Aquarius, which has an association with the 11th house, to engage in group activities, collaborative activities, and group creativity. Now, Pluto was last in Aquarius from 1778 through 1798, and this was the time of the American French Revolutions that showed that power can reside with the people instead of a single individual. So it's not all going to be fun and games. Whenever Pluto moves from Capricorn into Aquarius, there's always a shift of power to the people. And right now, it appears to be not the American Revolution, French Revolution, but the Ukrainian Revolution. Ukraine fighting for its freedom from the power of a single individual that wants to control it. And before I talk about this slide, let me also mention that back during the American Revolution, America formed an alliance with France to battle against England, Great Britain, and then Spain also made an alliance with France and also went to war with Great Britain. So back in this period from 1778 on, when Pluto was last in Aquarius, it was America, France, and Spain that were sort of the NATO of that day. And we have, again, as I say, something very similar going on today, only this time it's Ukraine fighting for freedom. It's Russia and Putin that are the aggressors, and it's America and NATO that have joined in to help defend Ukraine. Okay, now let's get to this slide because this is very interesting. Pluto will be in its retrograde zone for almost the entirety of 2023. It entered that retrograde zone on January 8th, doesn't leave until January 31st of 2024. And it's going to spend all its time just at 0+ degrees Aquarius this year for the 2.5 months that it's in Aquarius. And this is extremely important due to past conjunctions of this longitude. Also, 0+ degrees Aquarius is the beginning of collaborative energies and move away from authoritarianism, a planting of Aquarian seeds for freedom and technology that will sprout over time. Now, if we go back a little bit, see what happened at 0+ degrees Aquarius. Well, on March 31st, 2020, the malefic planets, Mars and Saturn, were conjunct at 0+ degrees Aquarius, and the COVID pandemic was raging. Remember, it really took off exponentially in March. And this conjunction, it added a touch of aggression restriction to this position, while also representing the global collaboration of aggressive science that occurred to combat the pandemic. Later that same year, on December 21st, 2020, we had the big one, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, 0+ degrees Aquarius. This conjunction happens every 20 years, but this one was a mutation conjunction, since it signaled a shift to air signs after spending about 200 years in Earth signs. Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto shifting from Earth into air, we're moving away from materialism into an age of ideas, invention, collaboration, and relationships. Now, ideally, Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions always try to restore balance between growth and restriction, freedom and regulation. However, they also have a long history of shaking things up in Europe. For the past several hundred years, these conjunctions have had a particular impact on European affairs, and this is one of the astrological reasons behind the war in Ukraine right now. There are lots of others that I've gone over in some other videos. Okay, on March 6, 2022, Venus and Mars were conjunct at 0+ degrees Aquarius. But earlier, on March 3rd, there was a triple conjunction of Pluto, Mars, and Venus at 27+ degrees Capricorn. And I view the conjunction Capricorn in terms of Russia's recent invasion of Ukraine. And by the way, 27+ degrees Capricorn, transing Pluto was there, and that's where, remember, natal Pluto is in all those July 1776 charts for America. So that brought us into this very strongly. However, I see the conjunction this day in Aquarius as representing the coordinated response of NATO. Remember, Aquarius represents group action and group creativity. So, much of what's happening now, as I see it, relates back to both the malevolent conjunction of Pluto and Saturn, January 12th, 2020, over here, and the more beneficial mutation conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn on December 21st, 2020, which is also the winter solstice. So here we have the Pluto-Saturn conjunction, very malevolent, and here we have the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, more hopeful. Now, let's talk about the impact of Saturn entering Pisces on March 7th of 2023. Well, when Saturn enters Pisces, that's when one's dreams can become reality. And some of the good things that have happened in the past years when Saturn went to Pisces are Social Security was enacted in 1935, Beatles and the British invasion of music in 1964, the World Wide Web providing an elegant interface for the internet in 1994. All of those were very nice and positive. Pisces can represent a very sophisticated, a very elegant kind of energy, a very compassionate energy, which can manifest both politically and in music. And here, in terms of an elegant way to surf the internet. Furthermore, Saturn and Neptune, they're both going to be in Pisces for the next 3 years. They're co-present. And that is going to be somewhat like a 3-year conjunction of these planets. And with Saturn in Pisces, we can also expect some old structures to deteriorate and dissolve. And since it will be co-present with Neptune, it'll be like this extended conjunction with Neptune. This is going to last about 3 years and will culminate with the Saturn-Neptune conjunction at 0+ degrees Aries in February 2026. And I claim that both Russia and America will be affected. Russia will be affected because past Saturn-Neptune conjunctions have had a significant impact on Russia. There's one in 1917 that's followed by the Bolshevik Revolution. There's one in 1952 that was followed by the death of Stalin and subsequent de-Stalinization. And there's one in 1989 that coincided with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union. And this one, fall of the Berlin Wall, that is a perfect metaphor for a conjunction of Saturn and Neptune because Saturn represents structure, Neptune dissolves structure. We saw that structure literally dissolve before our eyes. We've talked before about how with slow-moving planets going through Pisces, it tends to trigger that opposition to Neptune and that square to Mars and Gemini, just like happened for the Civil War. And remember that right the day immediately after shots were fired on Fort Sumter, Neptune was at 0+ degrees Aries, making a square to Venus at 0+ degrees Cancer, which is also the ruler of the rising sign in that July 2nd, 1776 chart, with the passing of the resolution for independence. So we're seeing a lot of things that happened right before the Civil War being repeated. And on this day, we not only have Neptune making a very, very strong square to natal Venus in this July 2, 1776 chart, but also Saturn and the Moon, which Neptune will be strongly conjunct with. So things may come to a head in 2025, 2026 for both Russia and America. And I say 2025 because in the summer of 2025, both Neptune and Saturn will have briefly moved into Aries, and in July, it looks like they get very, very close to an exact conjunction. It's not quite exact, and then they retrograde back into Pisces, re-enter Aries again together in early 2026, and make that exact conjunction in February 2026. I personally think there's a 50-50 chance that Putin will be gone before the end of this year, 2023, and that Russia may collapse by February 2026. America seems to be in better shape, but it is currently trying to resolve threats to its own democracy. In both Putin's chart and Russia's chart, there's first going to be some adverse aspects from Saturn, which is restriction, then aspects made by Chiron, which is wounding, and then some adverse aspects from Uranus, which will be pushing for change. Putin's grip on power may be too strong for him to be removed, but there will certainly be that drive for change in the latter half of this year. Currently, America seems to be trying to rediscover its political center again, but a lot of what happens between now and this February 2026, it may depend upon who wins the January 2024 presidential election. So there's a lot of turmoil ahead for both America and Russia over the next 3 years. But there will also be one shining moment in time for the whole world that may mitigate some of the tensions in the world. And that moment is on January 21st, 2026, when almost all the planets will be joined in great harmony through trines and sextiles. Here you can see Pluto, sextile Neptune, sextile Uranus, sextile Jupiter, Moon, trine, North Node, sextile Chiron, trine, South Node. All of these aspects are exact to the degree. So whatever is born at this moment will likely unleash a harmony that will impact the world for decades to come or even longer. This is the most harmony I've seen since those incredible conjunctions that we saw at the beginning of this presentation back in years BCE that ushered in world major religions and philosophies in the world. Finally, here's what I call Doc Benton's Red Yarn Conspiracy Board. It refers to many things I've talked about in this presentation and some I've talked about in a few others. So we had a whole slew of conjunctions at 22 degrees Capricorn, and they brought us a global pandemic, Putin wanting to restore the Soviet Union, Putin invading Ukraine, but also COVID vaccines being developed. Recently, this March, we had Saturn semisextile Pluto, and that indicated that we're entering a new phase for both the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. Over the next 3 years, while Saturn and Neptune are in Pisces, we may see Russia collapse. We may see America restore its democracy. A lot hinges upon that 2024 presidential election. In other presentations, I talked about the Jupiter conjunct Chiron, which occurred on March 11th of this month, 2023. And based upon past conjunctions, something wonderful will happen. This one will probably involve individual spirituality or spiritual warriors in some way. But past conjunctions also teach us that sometimes it's not until several years later that we realize what really began this month. The Chiron opposition to U.S. Saturn and Chiron near conjunct U.S. Chiron this summer, that poses a heightened risk of wounding for America. And then we've also had a lot of things happen at 0+ degrees Aquarius in recent years. Pluto entering into Aquarius this month, and this has resulted and will result in global response to COVID, NATO response to the war in Ukraine, new age of ideas, an age of invention, globalism, and power to the people. Hallelujah. Okay, let me close with an actual statistical study on mundane astrology that's very interesting. This was a study that looked at associations between conjunctions and outer oppositions of outer planets, and the number of news reports at www.onthisday.com that occurred either in the year of the conjunction or the previous year. Okay, and onthisday.com, it doesn't give a whole lot of news events. It just gives the highlights for a day or for the year. So there's just a handful of really important news events for a year. But in a nutshell, it found that when we had more of these conjunctions and oppositions between outer planets, we had more news that year. And the probability of what was observed being due to chance was pretty darn small, just 0.0085, which looks very significant, very important. So, low number of news events was defined as less than or equal to 7 per year, and high was defined as greater than or equal to 8. Also, few conjunctions or oppositions was defined as 0 or 1, and many was defined as 2 or more for the current or previous year. And these are the results. This table shows what was observed for many aspects or few aspects, and high number of highlights in the year or low number of highlights in the year. And the actual observations, the counts are given in black, Mathematically, what was expected was given in red. And when we have a lot of difference between observed and expected, that is when the results start to look significant. They look like they were not just due to chance. And the probability of these results being due to chance was pretty small, just 0.0085. Now, another way to understand what's going on here is to look at both column percentages and row percentages. And if we look at column percentages, we see that when there were many aspects, the number of news highlights was high, 68% of the time, and low, 32% of the time. That's a ratio of 2.125. So we had more than twice as many high news highlights when there were many aspects in the year or in the previous year. Similarly, when there were few aspects, the number of news highlights was high, 23% of the time, and low, 77% of the time. The ratio of 77% to 23% is 3.348. So when there were few aspects in the year or in the previous year, you were more than 3 times as likely to have just a low number of news highlights in the year. Okay, looking at the row percentages, this is even more dramatic for the top row. When we look at this row for high number of highlights in the year, there were many aspects 85% of the time, and low aspects only 15% of the time. That ratio of 85% to 15% is 5.667. So when you have a high number of news highlights in the year, you're more than 5 times more likely to have many of these conjunctions or oppositions between the outer planets in that year or in the previous year. Now, in years when we had a low number of aspects, or a low number of news highlights in the year, rather, the results were not quite as dramatic. You had many aspects in the year or in the previous year, 44% of the time. Few aspects in the year or in the previous year, 56% of the time. So low number of news highlights certainly corresponded with few aspects in that year or the previous year, but the ratio of 56% to 44% wasn't quite as dramatic as this one, only 1.278. This one, again, it's really dramatic. Okay, well, that's my last slide. Let me stop sharing here. And here I am again. So, from these case studies, the case studies of extreme astrological conditions and the extreme events that follow, plus from the statistical study on mundane astrology, this stuff really seems to work. So that is just more scientific evidence that supports astrology. So I hope you join me for my next presentation. I think my next one is my last one in which I'll wrap everything up, but I'll have to check on that, and so we'll see. Nonetheless, I hope to see you soon.